May 30, 2008. Just before 8 a.m. on Manhattan's Upper East Side, a tower crane stationed at a 34-story residential, office, and school construction site at 330-1333 East 91st Street detached from its slewing unit base. The crane fell roughly 200 feet, striking a building, bouncing off terraces, and finally landing in the street below. 2 men died that morning: crane operator Donald Leo, 30 years old, and construction worker Ramadan Kurtaj, 27 years old. Investigators would eventually trace the collapse to a single point of failure, a weld just below the operator's cab, located in the slewing unit base that connected the crane's turning mechanism to its tower. That weld had been repaired once before, after an earlier crack was discovered. This was not a new, unblemished piece of steel meeting an unforeseeable stress. It was a component with a documented history of cracking, sitting at the exact point where the crane ultimately failed. What follows is not a story about a single bad weld. It is a story about how that weld ended up back in service, why the people responsible for catching defects did not catch this one, and what the city's own inspection system looked like in the months before the fall. The facts here come from litigation records, criminal indictments, and an 11-month civil trial. They describe a chain of decisions about equipment reuse, about warnings received and ignored, about inspections signed off without being performed, that together produced a fatal outcome on an ordinary Friday morning in Manhattan. No dramatic external event caused this collapse. No earthquake, no storm, no impact from another structure. The crane simply came apart at a weld that multiple people, across multiple organizations, had reason to know was suspect. The slewing unit base that failed was identified in later litigation by an internal designation: 52. That designation matters because it tells investigators this specific part had a paper trail. A year before the collapse, Base 52 had been removed from another Manhattan job site, not because it reached the end of a routine service life, but because it had developed a dangerous crack. Rather than being retired or subjected to a full independent teardown and inspection, it was repaired and put back into service, this time on the crane at 330-1333 East 91st Street. A repaired weld on a component that had already cracked once was now bearing the full rotational load of a working tower crane above a dense residential block. But the story does not stop with one repaired part. Crane owner James F. Lama had received a specific warning from his supplier, Brady Marine, about this exact model of slewing unit base. A second unit of the same model, installed on a different crane at a different job site, was found to have a visibly defective weld, full of voids and poor fusion, the kind of flaw that is often detectable on inspection without exotic testing. This was not a vague or generalized caution about aging equipment. It was a specific, model-matched warning about a defect pattern. Lama took no action to inspect the base already in service at East 91st Street. There was no field trip to re-examine Base 52 in light of what had just been found in its twin. No stand-down order, no expedited ultrasonic testing, no schedule pause to rule out the same defect on the same model. The crane kept running, lifting materials on an active high-rise job site in the middle of Manhattan, while the one piece of information that could have prompted a closer look sat unacted upon. In hindsight, the sequence is stark. A component with a known crack history, repaired and returned to service. A supplier's warning about the same model's manufacturing flaws surfacing elsewhere, and no inspection triggered by that warning on the unit that was actually working overhead. Each decision, taken alone, might be explained as a reasonable judgment made without the full picture. Taken together, they describe an operator who had more than one opportunity to catch the defect before it became fatal, and did not take any of them. If the equipment history explains how a flawed weld ended up in service, the inspection system explains why nobody caught it before the crane fell. After the collapse, New York City Department of Buildings crane inspector Edward Marquette was indicted for falsifying his inspection route sheet on 3 separate dates. One of those falsified entries was dated March 4, 2008, just weeks before the crane came down. An inspection route sheet is supposed to be a record that an inspector was physically present, that a specific set of checks was performed on a specific date. Falsifying it does not just create a paperwork gap, It creates the appearance of oversight where none occurred. Marquette's case was not an isolated lapse. The city's then-chief crane inspector, James DeLeo, was separately convicted and sentenced to 2 to 6 years in prison for accepting more than $10,000 in bribes from New Way Crane Service and its executive Michael Sakaris in exchange for falsified inspections. This was not one inspector cutting a corner under schedule pressure. It was a bribery scheme running through the leadership of the city's crane inspection unit itself, exposed in the aftermath of the 2008 collapses. When the person in charge of enforcing inspection standards is himself taking payment to falsify results, the entire premise of third-party verification collapses, not just for one crane, but for the standard against which every crane in the system was supposedly being measured. The private sector provided no backstop. Testwell Company, a materials testing firm, had inspected the East 91st Street crane 3 months before it fell. Testwell was later indicted for what prosecutors described as outright fraud. So the layers that were supposed to catch a defect like the one in Base 52, a private testing firm, and a city inspection unit, were each compromised in their own way at the exact time this crane was in service. This is the institutional root cause beneath the mechanical one. A single repaired weld failing is a maintenance and engineering story. But a repaired weld failing, while the city inspector falsified his route sheet 3 months before the fall, while the chief inspector was taking bribes to falsify results across a fleet of cranes, and while the private testing firm inspecting this specific crane was later charged with fraud. That is a story about a verification system that had been hollowed out from multiple directions at once, leaving equipment history and supplier warnings as the only real safeguards left, and those had already failed. 2 people went to work that Friday morning and did not come home. Donald Leo, 30 years old, was operating the crane itself, positioned in the cab that sat just above the weld that gave way. Whatever warning signs existed in the metal beneath him, the prior crack, the repair, the unaddressed supplier alert about the same model elsewhere, were invisible from inside that cab. Leo had no way to see the defect pattern that Brady Marine had already flagged to the crane's owner. Because that information never triggered an inspection of the part he depended on every time he went to work. Ramadan Kurtaj, 27, was a construction worker on the ground at the site, going about ordinary work on an active high-rise job in a dense residential neighborhood. He was not operating the crane, not responsible for its maintenance history, not in any position to know that the slewing unit base above him had already been pulled from one job site for cracking before being repaired and reinstalled on this one. Both men were positioned at the end of a chain of decisions made by others, by an equipment owner who received a specific warning and did not act on it, by a repair process that returned a previously cracked part to active service, by a city inspector who falsified a route sheet weeks before the collapse, by a chief inspector taking bribes to falsify results across the system, and by a private testing firm later accused of outright fraud after inspecting this very crane 3 months earlier. Neither Leo nor Kurtaj had any part in those decisions. The crane fell roughly 200 feet, struck a building, bounced off terraces, and landed in the street, a trajectory that, in this case, ended 2 lives rather than passing through empty space. The physical and institutional failures described up to this point are not abstractions once placed alongside these 2 names. A repaired weld is a technical detail until it is the specific point of failure beneath a man operating the crane above it. A falsified inspection route sheet is a paperwork violation until it represents the exact multi-week window before a fatal collapse in which a real inspection might have caught something. The bribery scheme inside the city's inspection unit is a corruption case until it is understood as the mechanism by which an entire city's worth of crane inspections lost their meaning. On the same kind of equipment, in the same period, in the same city where Leo and Kurtaj were working. There is no additional detail in the record about their lives beyond their ages and roles. What the record does establish clearly is that the failures described in this script were not unknowable at the time. A warning had been given. A part had a documented crack history. Inspectors were falsifying records. 2 men were working beneath and around a crane that every one of those failures had already touched before it fell. The legal process that followed took years to resolve, and it did not resolve cleanly. In 2012, a judge acquitted James Lama of criminal manslaughter charges related to the collapse. That acquittal closed off criminal liability for the crane owner under the standard prosecutors had to meet. But it did not end the civil litigation. An 11-month civil trial, involving 87 witnesses, concluded on July 30, 2015, with the jury finding the crane owners negligent. A different legal standard, reached through a much longer and more detailed examination of the facts than the criminal case had involved. The two outcomes sit side by side in the record: acquitted of criminal manslaughter in 2012, found civilly negligent in 2015, both concerning the same collapse, the same weld, and the same warning from Brady Marine that had gone unacted upon. On the inspection side, the reckoning was more direct. Edward Marquette was indicted for falsifying his route sheet. James DeLeo was convicted and sentenced to 2 to 6 years in prison for the bribery scheme that ran through the city's crane inspection unit. Testwell Company was indicted for fraud tied to its inspection of this specific crane 3 months before it fell. Each of these outcomes addressed a distinct piece of the failure: the falsified paperwork, the bribed inspections, the fraudulent private testing, without any single proceeding capturing the full chain from Brady Marine's warning to Lama's inaction to Marquette's falsified sheet to DeLeo's bribes. That fragmentation is itself part of the story. A defect pattern was flagged on a matching component at another job site. A part with a known crack history was repaired and returned to service rather than retired. The warning about the matching defect never triggered a reinspection of the part actually in use. The city's own inspection layer was compromised by falsified records weeks before the collapse and by a bribery scheme reaching the chief inspector. The private testing layer, inspecting this exact crane 3 months prior, was later charged with fraud. No single failure caused this collapse in isolation. It was produced by a sequence in which every available check, supplier warning, owner response, city inspection, private testing, failed to intersect with the one piece of steel that mattered. At the one moment it mattered, above a Manhattan street where Donald Leo and Ramad Kurtaj were doing their jobs on an ordinary Friday morning in May of 2008.